Okay, so you want to own a private prison. Build a concrete building, fill it with cells, hire some guards, and collect a government check for every person behind the doors. It sounds like running a hotel, except nobody books a room voluntarily, there is no review on TripAdvisor, and your only customer is the federal government. You picture a grim but straightforward business. People commit crimes, the state needs somewhere to put them, you provide the somewhere, and you get paid. More prisoners, more money. Simple. Here is the problem. You are looking at the most politically volatile business model in the entire American economy. A cafe survives a change of government. A private prison can gain or lose hundreds of millions of dollars based on who wins a single election. And the deeper you dig into how this industry actually works, the more you realize that the cells are not really the product. The contracts are the product. The policy is the product. And sometimes the product keeps generating revenue long after the person has walked out the gate. Let us start with what this business actually is. Because the mental image most people carry is wrong. You imagine a warden, a set of keys, and a building full of convicted felons. That is one version, but a modern private corrections company is not just a building with bars on the windows. It is a sprawling logistics and surveillance operation that can include prisons, immigration detention centers, prisoner transportation fleets, halfway houses, reentry programs, GPS ankle monitors, alcohol monitoring devices, smartphone supervision applications, and probation case management services. You are not buying a prison. You are buying a vertically integrated government services conglomerate that happens to have started with a prison. GEO Group, one of the two largest operators in the industry, reported that its operations included roughly 75,000 beds across 96 facilities as of March 2026. But that number only tells part of the story. GEO also runs electronic monitoring and community supervision businesses. Its contract with Immigration and Customs Enforcement covers GPS bracelets, wrist devices, mobile applications, and case management. The number of participants wearing its GPS bracelets rose from about 17,000 in early 2025 to more than 48,000 by May 2026. That is not a prison statistic. That is a tech platform growth curve wearing an ankle bracelet. So here is the first and perhaps most disturbing financial observation in this entire business. The prison does not necessarily lose the customer when the gate opens. It can replace the cell with a bracelet. It can replace the bracelet with a smartphone app. It can replace the app with a check-in at a reentry center. The person moves through the system, and the company follows them through each stage, billing the government at every single step. A gym loses the member when they cancel. A cinema loses the viewer when the credits roll. A private corrections company can retain its revenue relationship with the same individual across years, across facilities, across the boundary between incarceration and freedom itself. That should already make you uncomfortable. Good. That discomfort is the right response. Let us keep going. Now, how does the money actually flow? The private operator does not arrest anyone. It does not decide who gets sentenced or for how long. A government agency, federal, state, or local, contracts the company to provide a certain number of beds and a certain level of service. Think of it like outsourcing. The government says, we need 1,000 beds of detention capacity, and we do not want to build and staff the facility ourselves. The company says, we will build it, staff it, maintain it, and charge you for the service. The contract is the entire business, period. The company may receive a daily payment for every occupied bed, a fixed monthly facility fee, guaranteed payments for a minimum level of capacity, reimbursement for startup and renovation costs, transportation revenue, medical and food service payments, and electronic monitoring revenue on top of all of that. One GEO contract for a company-owned 1,000-bed immigration facility called Delaney Hall was announced as a 15-year fixed-price agreement, expected to generate more than $60 million annually in its first full operating year, and approximately $1 billion over the life of the contract, including normal cost adjustments. Read that again. One building, one contract, $1 billion. The operator did not merely win a contract to fill some beds. It effectively attached a billion-dollar government revenue stream to a single piece of real estate. A restaurant owner would faint. A cinema operator would weep quietly. A gym owner would close their laptop and stare at the wall for a very long time. Here is where the economics become genuinely strange. In a normal business, empty capacity is a disaster. An empty hotel room generates zero revenue. An empty airline seat flies at a loss. An empty restaurant table is just furniture having a bad evening. But in the private detention business, empty beds can still get paid. Some detention contracts contain guaranteed minimums. The government agrees to pay for a certain number of beds, whether those beds are occupied or not. A Government Accountability Office investigation found that ICE had increasingly used these guarantees and had spent millions of dollars every month on unused detention capacity. One arrangement guaranteed approximately $2 million monthly for 650 spaces shared between two facilities. A normal hotel panics when its rooms are empty. A detention center may still invoice the government. The logic from the government's side is not entirely irrational. Detention demand can spike suddenly. If an enforcement surge happens and there is nowhere to hold people, the government has a crisis. Paying to keep beds warm is effectively an insurance premium on future capacity. But the economic result is that the contractor receives steady, predictable revenue, while the taxpayer carries the risk that the capacity may never be used. The company gets paid whether the beds are full or gathering dust. Most businesses would happily trade a kidney for that arrangement. This one gets it written into a contract. Now here is where the business gets truly fascinating. And by fascinating, I mean the kind of fascinating that makes you set down your coffee and say, that cannot possibly be real. An empty private prison is not always a dead asset. It can behave like a giant financial call option on future government policy. As of March 2026, GEO had 8 idle facilities containing a combined 6,646 vacant beds. Those empty buildings were costing the company approximately $26.7 million per year just to maintain. Security patrols, basic utilities, insurance, property taxes, structural upkeep. $26 million a year to babysit empty concrete. That is not a metaphor. That is a real line item. That sounds like a catastrophic waste of money. Except GEO estimated that if those facilities were reactivated at typical contract rates and occupancy levels, they could generate approximately $300 million in additional annual revenue. So the company spends $27 million a year maintaining buildings that produce nothing. Because one policy change, one executive order, one shift in enforcement priorities can transform those buildings into a $300 million revenue engine practically overnight. A closed factory needs customers, supply chains, retooled machinery, and months of ramp-up before it can restart. A closed prison mainly needs a government contract and enough employees to unlock the doors. The barrier to reactivation is almost absurdly low compared to any other industrial asset. You do not need to find customers. You do not need to convince anyone to buy your product. You just need the government to decide it needs more beds. And governments, as a rule, change their minds with remarkable and sometimes alarming frequency. This is not theoretical. CoreCivic, the other major private prison operator, had a 2,400-bed facility in Dilley, Texas, that lost its funding and went idle in August 2024. It was reactivated in March 2025. 7 months of silence, 7 months of carrying costs and zero revenue, and then the lights came back on. By the fourth quarter of 2025, CoreCivic reported that its ICE revenue had risen from $120.3 million to $244.7 million year over year, more than doubling, partly because previously idle facilities had been brought back online. One political cycle turned a building that was losing money every month into a machine that helped double a revenue line. This makes private prisons fundamentally different from any business we have covered before. A gym's demand is created by people wanting to exercise, or at least wanting to believe they will exercise. A cinema's demand is created by Hollywood releasing films that people want to see. A car dealership's demand is created by people needing cars. In every case, the demand originates with a consumer making a choice. A private prison's demand is created by legislation, enforcement priorities, sentencing guidelines, and elections. The customer is not a person choosing a product. The customer is a government choosing a policy. And policies, unlike consumer preferences, can reverse completely in the span of a single inauguration. This means the private prison operator is not really in the corrections business. It is in the government policy speculation business that happens to own a lot of concrete. Now let us talk about what is inside the building, because the physical asset itself is one of the strangest pieces of real estate you can own. A private prison contains reinforced cells, electronic locking systems, layered surveillance networks, secure commercial kitchens, medical units, perimeter fencing with detection systems, centralized control rooms, dedicated visitation areas with security screening, sally ports designed for armored vehicle transfer, and redundant backup power and communication systems. It is, in engineering terms, an extraordinarily specialized facility. And that specialization is both its greatest strength and its most dangerous trap. Without a government contract, a private prison is almost impossible to repurpose. You cannot convert it into apartments. The cells are too small, the plumbing is wrong, and the reinforced doors send a certain message to prospective tenants. You cannot turn it into a warehouse. The layout is designed to control human movement, not facilitate the movement of goods. You cannot turn it into a hotel, despite the superficial similarity, because hotels generally try to make their guests feel welcome rather than prevented from leaving. So a private prison owner is not investing in flexible real estate. They are investing in the probability that the government will continue needing incarceration capacity at that specific location. The building has almost no alternative use. The contract is everything. Take away the contract, and you own a very expensive, very secure, very empty building in a location that was probably not chosen for its scenic charm. The contract can therefore be more valuable than the physical prison, which is a sentence that sounds absurd until you spend 5 minutes looking at the financials. There is another chapter of this business that deserves its own discussion, and it is the one that generates the most controversy and the most litigation: labor inside the facility. At one GEO-operated immigration detention center in Washington state, detainees participating in a voluntary work program were paid $1 per day to perform tasks including cleaning, cooking, facility repairs, and staffing the library and barbershop. $1 per day. In a state where the minimum wage was considerably higher than $1 per anything. A federal appeals court upheld combined judgments exceeding $23 million against GEO, finding that the company was not automatically shielded from Washington's minimum wage requirements simply because it was operating under a federal contract. GEO disputed the ruling and pursued further appeals. The financial structure this creates is genuinely disorienting. The government pays the company to house a person. That person then helps maintain the facility for compensation that would not cover a cup of coffee in the building's own vending machine. The company receives revenue for the detention, and simultaneously reduces its operating costs through the labor of the people being detained. It is, depending on your perspective, either a reasonable work program that gives detainees something productive to do, or a business model that would make a 19th century factory owner raise an eyebrow and ask if that was really allowed. This must be noted carefully. The case involves civil immigration detainees, not convicted prisoners serving criminal sentences, and the legal frameworks governing labor inside detention facilities vary significantly between jurisdictions, between federal and state law, and between immigration detention and criminal incarceration. The rules are genuinely complicated, and oversimplifying them does a disservice to the actual legal questions at stake. But the optics of a billion-dollar company paying $1 a day to the people generating its per-bed revenue are, to put it diplomatically, not great. So what does the complete financial picture look like? Start with the revenue side. A large private corrections company generates income from daily bed rates, facility management fees, guaranteed minimum payments, transportation contracts, medical and food service agreements, electronic monitoring subscriptions, community supervision fees, and reentry program billing. The revenue is overwhelmingly governmental. The contracts are long-term, the rates are negotiated, and the demand is driven not by consumer behavior, but by policy decisions made in Washington, in state capitals, and in voting booths. On the cost side, the company bears payroll for correctional officers and administrative staff, facility maintenance and capital improvements, food service, medical care, insurance, legal defense costs, and the carrying cost of idle facilities held in reserve for future activation. Staffing is the largest single expense. Prisons are labor-intensive operations. You cannot automate a guard. You cannot outsource a headcount. Every occupied bed requires a certain ratio of staff, and that ratio is usually set by regulation, not by the company's preference. The margin sits between those two mountains. When occupancy is high, contracts are long, and the political environment favors enforcement, the business generates strong, predictable cash flow with a governmental credit quality that most industries would envy. The United States government is, whatever else you might say about it, unlikely to bounce a check. When occupancy drops, contracts are not renewed, and the political pendulum swings the other direction, the company is left carrying enormous fixed costs against declining revenue, maintaining expensive buildings that may sit idle for years before the cycle turns again. And that is the final and most important structural observation about this entire industry. A private prison is not a business that responds to market demand. It is a business that responds to political demand. And political demand does not follow the smooth, rational curves that economists like to draw on whiteboards. It lurches. It reverses violently. It doubles in a single quarter and halves in the next. It is driven by elections, by emergencies, by public sentiment, by cable news segments, and by executive orders that can be signed on a Monday morning and take effect by Tuesday afternoon. The people who run these companies understand this perfectly. They maintain idle facilities the way a military maintains reserve equipment, not because it is profitable today, but because the next mobilization could come at any time. They diversify into electronic monitoring and community supervision not because they love technology, but because those revenue streams are less politically visible and less subject to the binary on-off switch of detention policy. They sign 15-year contracts not because they are patient, but because a long contract is the only hedge against an election that could otherwise zero out their revenue in a single budget cycle. The private prison business does not sell cells. It sells governments the ability to rapidly expand and contract incarceration and detention capacity without building, staffing, and maintaining every facility with public employees. The company absorbs the operational complexity. The government supplies the people. The taxpayer supplies the revenue. And the ankle bracelet, quietly and profitably, supplies the sequel.